Hey, this is John from Gateon. Today I just want to go over basically how do you actually learn anything through independent study. And the reason why I'm doing this is as a primer to a series that we're going to be doing in the future on investment analysis. So I do understand that a lot of people have chimed in on a number of things like, how do you be a polymath? How do you learn things independently? And maybe those are better videos, maybe they're not. I don't know. I don't really care because I haven't watched them. So here's my video though. Now, basically, the way that I take care of those things is I basically want to define three things: the subject and the goal of learning it. So pretty much, getting an overview and describing how deeply I want to study the subject, the materials I'm going to use, and like then structuring it and giving it like an approximate time allotment. And I feel like these are all just very important things. Now, on the side, I have what I think are 4 keys to learning anything. And some of this is kind of obvious, but I do think it's worth reiterating here and giving realistic expectations for certain things like time. And then I will have some examples below of some of the things that I've been looking at recently. I guess, over a long period of time. Now, so start off with subject and goal. So basically, I've just kind of divided this into 3 different levels of depth. One is just topical literacy, so pretty much the communication of the idea to a general audience that's maybe relatively uninformed, or just understanding how the subject fits into other things, like, for example, like how do businesses use machine learning in its functions. So that could kind of be included in this. And basically at this level, the kinds of materials that you'd want to use are generally either videos or like mass media books. So it's very straightforward. It's very easy to learn at this level. There's not a lot of detail, and it will probably only take about 10, maybe 20 hours. So like the average like mass media book will probably take somewhere between like 6 to 10 hours to get through. Not very long. Sometimes less, but anyways, that's approximately probably what you should expect if you're a decent reader. Okay. Now, aside from that, looking at amateur versus professional utility levels, basically the differences here are, are you doing these things on a more irregular basis, like an outstanding project, or are you expecting to do this on an ongoing basis for something like research or developing something new? Both of which I think require, and really like maybe original outputs can probably be described as research anyways, just in a general manner. But I think the easiest question to ask if you're kind of between these two on whether or not you should be at this level of depth or this level of depth is basically, are you doing a one-off project, or are you trying to build a career from that? And if you're trying to build a career from that, you pretty much have to be down at this level. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to get anywhere. For example, you're going to be competing with other people that are at this level. So, good luck. Okay, but let's talk about amateur utility for a minute. I think probably the best way to take this is to focus on a single topic in a subject rather than trying to get like a very shallow understanding of the subject overall. So, for example, imagine that you're trying to do like a survey of math rather than just say learning statistics. You'd probably get almost nothing out of the survey anyways. Whereas at least if you just focus on statistics, you can get reasonably far with even just, like 5 books. So, yeah. Now, although I do think that courses are, usable. I'm not a big fan of them anymore, and so I mostly focus on textbooks. But in this range, you're probably looking at covering maybe like somewhere in like the 1 to 3 course range, and maybe 1 to 5 textbooks is what I would generally put down here. The reason why I'm not a huge fan of courses, why I think eventually you have to kind of migrate away from them to get into the deeper levels, is because they just don't have the same amount of detail. But they can be less boring for some people, not for me personally. And I think they also provide a introduction to the kind of rigor that's required if you've never been in a course before. So, saying that courses are necessary in hindsight of having courses is probably a little bit disingenuous. So you probably do have to take some courses, at least initially, even for the deeper levels, just to get a good grasp on the level of rigor that's required. Now, again, like I said, I would suggest that you focus on a single topic rather than trying to get like broad coverage. You can do that. I just don't think the result is going to be very very good. And so, probably in this level, you're probably looking at spending like 100 to 200 hours to go and learn something. But that can definitely have wide variance depending on what you're trying to do exactly. Okay, now for research, generally you're just going to have to read a lot. You're not going to get the level of depth that you need, I think, anywhere else, because I don't think that anybody but you has that time to spend on your learning. Okay, so you're probably looking at 15 to 30 textbooks down here, and then you're looking at various research papers you're going to read depending on what you're doing. So, for example, when I was in neuroscience and I did research there, we, on the last, on my thesis project, I did research into neurotrophins, and so all the research that I was reading then was focused on things like synaptic plasticity, learning and memory, Alzheimer's, and neurotrophins. Right. So all pertaining to the project. Okay, and similar thing when you go and move on and do whatever else you're gonna do. Yeah. Okay, and then it's just a lot of time. So you should be pretty sure when you do want to move down to this level. And I would say probably if you're doing this as a out of self-interest, like with math. I know that a lot of people are doing that with math now. You're probably gonna have to do this on the side for several years. So just keep that in mind, and I would suggest that if you are trying to get down here, don't be discouraged. Everyone has to spend a lot of time doing this. Now, let's talk a little bit about the 4 ingredients that I have here. One is obviously time. It does take a very long time to get through stuff. Now, I haven't been to a point where I've had to think about, say, a single page of a math textbook for a day, that I know other people apparently have. But you can certainly find yourself spending 20-30 minutes on a page for sure, I think, sometimes. And so it takes a lot to work through things now, and that's not true of all things. For example, business textbooks and investment analysis textbooks often read very much like like any other literature would, to be honest, especially at this point. And as you gain familiar with the topic, those books go faster and faster. So what I would generally suggest is that when you do structure things, you gradually increase difficulty, as I put down here, but also for the sake of time and making each individual component take less time. Okay, now how long does it actually take to read a textbook? I would say generally between 40 to 60 hours, and probably about 80 to 120 for a math textbook. And you might be kind of wondering why does it take longer? You know, I think the content is just more difficult, more rigorous, and you got to think in, greater abstractions. There's also a level of specificity that you get from math that you don't get from a lot of other textbooks. So, anyways, we'll talk about that more down below. But, this obviously has great variance. For example, like I could probably get through something like the investment analysis book I had up in the finance tier list. I could probably get through that in maybe like 10 to 15 hours at this point. And why is that? Well, I'm familiar with the subject already, and I'm a very good reader. So again, as you read more on a topic, it'll get faster and faster. You might not have to read the entire books anymore to learn certain things, and you also might completely end up migrating away from textbooks at some point and just focusing on research. So there's that. I guess I should also say, by the way, like you do typically need to do projects as well alongside these things. I forgot to mention this, but I'll get back to that in a second. But last comment, I did just want to say, even if you could just read like maybe an hour a day, based on this, like if we said 40 to 60 hours per book, right, you get through one book in about, a little over a month. So you get through like 5 to 10 books a year, textbooks, I mean, in particular. And, think about the amount of information you could gain from that. So it doesn't require a ton of time, just small, incremental, consistent efforts. Okay. Now, I wanted to also mention something very briefly before we continue through these, which is that something that a lot of people don't know. This is contrary to popular belief, but optimal learning strategies don't vary by individuals. They actually vary by subject matter. So, for example, a lot of people divide themselves into I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, I'm a kinesthetic learner. And while that's interesting in theory, that's not really true. So it turns out that you primarily they're better. I get so much information all the time, like just popping up, so distracting. As per the subject matter, that okay, whatever. For example, okay, so you wanted to learn about like the shape of graphs. That's obviously going to be better conveyed through a graph itself than a description of said graph. So, for example, if I said, a logarithmic function looks like a line that is past the intersection of the y and the x-axis and is only positive, or is only on the positive x-axis, and it goes up, and then eventually it starts to wane in terms of its ability to increase, so it reaches some horizontal asymptote. So that's probably a lot less confusing than me just showing a picture that shows this. Or at least it takes a lot more thinking. So it's very obvious that, in that case, a visual stimulus is easier to learn from. On the flip side, if I was describing something like a general concept of a group in abstract algebra, or ring, which is also very similar, it'd probably be a lot easier for me to say that a ring is a set with two well-defined operations on the set than some other, like weird depiction. And although you can depict a group through specific a ring in particular, through specific examples, it doesn't really describe the concept of a ring. So it's just easier to convey through audition. Now, arguably all things benefit from some practice of its application, because that gets you used to the nuance of the subject, and it's kind of impossible to go through all of the information on a subject anyways, given how much information is out there on any given subject. So you kind of have to practice getting used to adapting the concepts and working with them anyways. Yeah. So all things should get practiced, but just keep in mind that nobody actually has an optimal learning strategy attached to themselves. There's just optimal learning strategies depending on the subject. Okay, anyways. Dedication obviously needs structure and consistency, and if you're not willing to commit this time, I recommend, frankly, you probably shouldn't bother. Okay, motivation. To achieve motivation, and if you don't, you probably won't be very dedicated and you might give up, and after say like spending 500 hours on something, that might be a big problem. I think the easiest way to gain motivation and to keep it sensibly is to just focus on utility, unless you so obviously enjoy the subject that this is never going to be a problem, which is often the case with something like literature or philosophy. But in other cases, though, I'd recommend you focus on utility, because that's going to make it, just consistent and clear where your motivation is. Okay, and the last bit is attention. So I think everyone knows intuitively, yes, attention is important to learn something, but just to make this a little bit more obvious, it does also factor into neuroplasticity in a pretty significant way. Now, aside from that, motivation will increase your attention, and make sure that you sleep and manage your fatigue well. Because if you get bored or tired, you're not going to be paying very much attention. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that you should probably increase the difficulty progressively, not just to get used to harder adaptations of the topics, but also to keep yourself engaged. Okay, now let's go through some examples of a couple things. So I don't. It doesn't matter. Anyways, so let's start with math. So here's kind of a quick map of some of the things you can learn with math, and I haven't covered all of this. So for example, I'm probably never going to bother covering algebraic geometry, unfortunately. Maybe in a very long time from today, but also probably not. So. And why is that? Well, because it's such a specialized topic, as you can kind of see here, right? You'd have to, I would have to cover algebraic topology, commutative algebra, and then algebraic geometry, and that's going to take a lot of time. So, and I don't need it for anything. And why do I say focus on utility? I say that because there's always trade-offs, spending time on certain topics, especially when you can kind of just dig into a topic like this forever and ever. You could do other things with that time, and sometimes those things are very important, right? So you can't just unfortunately go unsensibly into a topic forever and ever. Okay, unless that's what you do for work. Okay, but let's take a couple things, because you can kind of see there's a lot of interconnections with this, and math is a very particular subject in that you often have to cover precursors prior to other things, and this, I'm gonna say, it's not necessarily true of a lot of other subjects. I think a lot of other subjects, like even genetics, for example, it'd be useful to cover molecular biology first, and maybe I even take it for granted that I've already covered that. But I also don't think that you have to, because genetics itself covers all the necessary components of cells you really need to understand. And then you don't really use any of that background knowledge in genetics anyways, I would say. So genetics textbooks seem very self-contained, whereas math textbooks don't really seem that way. So, for example, an abstract algebra textbook will typically cover topics in linear algebra as well, but only in a very cursory or more advanced manner, such that if you hadn't taken a course on linear algebra prior, you wouldn't really be prepared for those segments. And it's hard to understand exactly what I mean unless you've done that before, but that's just the way it is. So math has to be gone through in a sort of progressive manner. Now, I think there's some caveats to that. So, for example, let's take the notion of let's say we wanted to learn machine learning, right? I think there's a few different paths you could take to go and learn this, and these aren't all the paths. But for example, take discrete math and proofs. Technically, you don't have to do proofs to go and do real analysis. Kind of like frankly, you don't technically have to take calculus to do real analysis, but it's really recommended that you take both these courses or read books on these subjects prior to taking real analysis. And I think that if you took if you are struggling with real analysis, taking a book on proofs first is probably going to make the experience much better. So there's that. Now, you also don't have to take a course on I'm just saying course, you don't have to read on proofs before doing probability, though you probably should, and it depends on the level of detail that you want. So for example, if you're just trying to understand probability and statistics to the level of being able to like program machine learning models that are already like standard implementations, yeah, you don't really have to do any of the proofs. But if you wanted to work through any of the math, you will find it's very much the case that you will probably want a discrete math course prior to taking any rigorous probability course. You might not understand that, but when you start working through that, you'll understand, I guess. Okay, so nice. So there's all that, blah blah. Okay, now regarding investment analysis, so there's multiple paths you could take down here. Again, these are just examples of some like larger topics that I have covered a bit of. I'm also going to show a much less structured approach below to a more like I don't know, like hobby topic, if you will. Okay, so with investment analysis, there's a lot of things, a lot of directions you can take it. I would suggest you learn Excel or Python at the least, but probably both, to be honest. And Python really maybe only if you're going to be a quant, and honestly, if you're going to be a quant, then you probably also have to know C++ based on my understanding of that. But yeah, and also if you were going to learn Python, you don't have to learn algorithms, but you probably should. Okay, anyways, so once you have like the basic math though, say you wanted to work in like fundamental analysis of companies, these are generally the things that you want to cover first. So financial statement analysis and macroeconomics. And I am well aware that the CFA curriculum, that I've been through does cover a lot more than this. But I think these are probably the only things that are actually like strictly necessary to understand and do valuations well. Especially because you're probably not going to be doing like every type of valuation for work. You'll want to move to specialized valuations. So for example, you could read something like investment valuations by Dan Modern, and then move to a specialized valuation topic like biotech evaluations, for example, which you just get as a book, right? Alternatively, you can move down into portfolio theory, in which case I would recommend you cover and this could include things like modern portfolio theory and portfolio construction, and then things like asset allocation and measurement, which deals primarily with how you evaluate other portfolio managers. And this deals primarily with things like, when do I increase my allocations to alternative assets, for example, and what kinds of alternative assets. Okay, so is that now some more like hobby type topic that is just kind of an example of a less structured approach is with philosophy here. So you see like generally this is kind of like how I've kind of moved through it, and I've taken a couple courses, 3 courses on philosophy over whatever last 10 years, and then I've read a number of books. Now these are 2, so I'm currently working on existentialism, and I'm going to go back to logic later. though I've pretty much already been through logic, mostly for mathematics actually, but there's some philosophical logic that I'm planning to go back to later. Now, for the most part, philosophy is kind of it's a lot less structured in terms of the approach that you need to take compared to, say, math or even investment analysis. Because, for example, while you can probably read a book on valuations without going over FSA and macro econ, I don't think you're going to understand it, how these things fit into a portfolio very well, or why you would invest in these things, and how do you actually assess the horizon and come with forecasts. So you just, I don't see how you're going to be very good. Yeah. Okay. Now, whereas with philosophy, it seems to me like, though it can be very useful to start off with easier philosophers, and some of these are pretty dense, by the way, you might not expect it. I think really, unless you're doing analytic philosophy, you don't necessarily have to go and do this in a progressive manner, though it can help. But kind of like genetics, it's mostly self-contained. But if you were going to do analytic philosophy, then I believe you have to cover logic first. Okay. Anyways, I guess that's the end of the video. So, hopefully you enjoyed that. Again, this is going to be a primer for a series that we're going to do later. I don't know when, because I'm waiting to get ready to cover all of that. But that's going to be a series on investment analysis. It's going to be self-contained, and we'll do that later. So, anyways, if this was enjoyable or helpful or whatever, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, take care and Merry Christmas. Bye now.